which is similar, that you can say, okay, this has got a salt content, or this has got a good content, this is 35% good, or it's 40% bad, because of the fact it contains X element, because there is no such X element upon which we will judge what's good, what's bad. That's the issue. It's not about whether you like a thing. You may have your own personal tastes. You know, we both like blue. There may be lots of other things. Yeah, there may be lots of other things upon which we disagree.
No, the fault is just because we're wearing blue.
Okay. So, maybe you don't like the jumper. Okay. Well,
I don't buy my own clothes.
I see. Now, the issue is like or dislike is different from actually sensing and being able to judge upon that reality. That's my point.
Okay, gentleman.
Yeah. Sorry, Mr. Jamal. Just want to have a question with you, Dad. You talked about ijtihad. So, according to many Muslim greatest scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, Shari'a, even Islamic about in the 18th and 19th century, they have greatest emphasis on ijtihad. So, I just want to talk about the Arab imperialism. When there are four schools of thoughts like Hanafi and Shafi, they mostly stick to one of the school of thought, and they had a sort of taqleed, where they just stick to those kind of judgments which they have according to their jurisprudence. So I just want to say, is that because of lacking ijtihad during the Arab imperialism? I'm talking about Arab imperialism. It's not caliphate, it was a blood caliphate. So don't you think so that because we didn't actually have an emphasis on ijtihad, that we didn't actually show the true picture of Islam in the West? Because most of the people like who stick on those fiqhs, they always have the belief on those rules which were compatible according to the times as subordinate laws, not the divine laws. But don't you think so that we stop doing ijtihad as a true any Muslim state?
Could you just clarify any?
Clarify a few of the terms as well, yeah? Okay. So those of you who are not familiar with ijtihad and some of the other Islamic sciences or terminology that were used in the question, effectively, what the question is asking, if I understand it correctly, is that we saw the process of ijtihad, the process of arriving and deriving different opinions, was something that Muslims, they used to derive Islamic law. Now, effectively, to answer your question and to explain to the rest of the audience, we found that this was something that was common and accepted in the early eras of Islam, in the first 4, 5, 6 centuries. Then increasingly, this idea of an orthodoxy that you shouldn't actually encourage ijtihad, this started to develop. And this meant there were less actual development of different schools of thought and different views on the issues. There was a kind of traditionalism which set in. Now, over the long period of time, over the long term, that was bad for the Islamic world in terms of thinking, in terms of development, even in other areas like science and technology and so on, because you had an environment which wasn't as warm and welcoming to the emergence of new ideas as was the case in earlier generations. So in answer to that question, if we look at how revival of the Sharia will take place, because this discussion is not about per se, this country or that country is the best country in the world, i.e., Tunisia is the great model for what the West should follow, or this country in the Islamic world right now, but actually what model should Muslim countries adopt? I.e., if they want to revive, they want to move forward, and those, and I'm one of them, who call for Sharia, we're talking about a system that actually will produce an intellectual development in the Islamic world, will actually guarantee the rights of the citizens, according to the models that I discussed before, and would enable society to progress on its basis. So that's the kind of issue that I'm driving at, and that's why I see some of those problems did exist and led to a decline in the Islamic world, which can be reversed by returning to those original sources.
Yeah. Gentleman, but
am I allowed to ask two? Because I reckon this will probably not have time. Is that all right?
let's start and then.
Firstly, directed to Mr. Allison. In the absence of any objective standard of morality, and the fact that human deductions on maximum cost-benefit analysis of situations will always be prone to profound difference, do you accept that your utilitarian framework can consequently only lead to anarchy and chaos in society and conflict, and on that basis it should be rejected as a framework entirely and not adopted by them?
No. I mean, we operate like that now pretty effectively.
So you accept they will always consequently lead to conflict?
conflict and chaos, no, much less than any religious-based. Given the history of religious-based legal systems, which is of constant conflict and chaos, because of disagreements about sources and revelations, the fact that you can honestly accept that your judgment is going to be about consequences. Eisenhower, apparently, I must look this up actually, to go back to the Hiroshima thing, it seemed to me, I've sat in the room in Potsdam where Harry Truman made his decision, and know quite a lot about that decision and why it seemed to be a good idea. Now, the question is, that's the paradigm modern decision. All decisions, whether in the NHS or what, are like it a little bit. In other words, you're not choosing between, shall I do a good thing or a bad thing? You're choosing between this probability that 3 million people will die, this probability that it will be less, against this probability that 100,000 people will die, and so on. That's the choice that was made. Eisenhower may have been, I don't think, if Eisenhower did believe that, I don't think he was right instantly. I think Truman's advisors were absolutely correct about it, because the Soviet Union did enter the war, but wasn't going to fight, basically. Wasn't going to commit any resources to it. You are faced with those real calculations. Now, a book I edited on utilitarianism, a guy came up with a rather good argument, which was government house utilitarianism. If you and I are dealing with each other on a normal basis, we suspend an overall utilitarian judgment in favour of obeying the normal rules of obligation. In other words, if I borrowed £10 off you and said I'll pay you back next week, I'll pay you back next week, because that's a normal human obligation. When you get up to big levels, when we are dealing with a rogue state with nuclear weapons, and when we're dealing with the Japanese in 1945, and when we're dealing with some of the things that I fear are going to happen in the 21st century, you can't say, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? What does God say? What does the text say? You have to try and calculate the consequences. And you say it leads to chaos and anarchy, but that's what actual governments do all the time. They do it about traffic, they do it about health, and they do it about lots of things. That's the reality of the situation. Utilitarian morality is everywhere. Even in America, where they kind of pretend to be fundamentalists and have principles derived from the founding fathers, they act in that way. So, no, does it lead to chaos and anarchy? A bit, but much less than anything else.
You said earlier on that...
Who's your question, sorry?
Allison. You said earlier on that people in countries in the greater Middle East sort of aspire to live in a democracy like the West, and that the...
Did I?
You did say they want democracy and secularism.
Oh, I said that the people being interviewed in the streets of Cairo, who may not be a sample because they all spoke English. All right?
And you gave the impression that the West, the way people would live in the West has proven to be better than kind of the Middle East. How would you kind of explain that? For example, we've got situations like in 2004 when the prisoners in Iraq were kind of mistreated, and you've also got the situation in Holland where the prisoners had their television stolen. How come that's been allowed to happen?
I don't understand the question. I mean, human error, human weakness. What's going on here? I mean, am I claiming that everything is perfect here, or am I claiming it's better than Egypt?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. That's
the one's a pretty weak claim. The other's a rather foolishly strong claim, which I'm certainly not making. There are a lot of, sorry, I'm not condoning everything British governments do or whatever. If I was running the country, it would be a lot different, I can assure you.
Okay, sorry, could I just come back on some of this question? I think the first question was about, well, the question from the speaker at the top left was about the issue of judgment and whether your judgment of right and wrong is arbitrary. And your response was, well, they use it in the NHS, which to me doesn't actually validate whether it's a correct basis. His question was whether it's a correct basis or not, and your response was people do it all the time.
No, his question was, if people made judgments like this, would it not lead to chaos and anarchy? So my answer was, people do it all the time, and depending what you mean by chaos and anarchy and what you're trying to compare it to... Sorry,
I got a bit confused. Okay, so first of all, your response was that it's actually not leading to chaos and anarchy. So the first point I would say in terms of response to that...
I suppose I'd have to say it depends.
I mean, obviously, so you mentioned in the NHS, you've mentioned Truman, Potsdam, and so on. But the reality is that that's a set of judgments that are made within a particular context, and in many other contexts as well. The principle that you said before, natural rights and so on, human rights, these are used within Britain today. They're used within Western societies, but you're saying that those principles are not valid. So on one hand, you're saying that utilitarianism is producing these results in terms of judgment, and on the other hand, you're saying the basis that's used for most of the legal framework of the country today is an incorrect one. So I think that, again, it leads to this question about what's the basis for good and bad? Is that one that you've actually accepted or judging on correctly? Second of all, actually going back to the issue of the Islamic world, just to deal with this point very briefly, if you look at what people say they want in the Islamic world, you'll find overwhelming support for living by Sharia. I mean, obviously, as you said yourself, you have acknowledged that your BBC sample is obviously going to be a particular section of the society who are well-spoken and English-speaking as well. But you would find, even amongst the English speakers, actually, looking at polls, I mean, you look at recent polls in Egypt, just in December, actually, that you found over 80% of people talking about the need for Sharia, and they want the Sharia system to be in place, and seeing it not in place in Egypt at the moment. You also have the Gallup poll that took place a couple of years ago, again, 88% of men and women that saying that they would want the system in Egypt to be one based on Sharia. There are actually a lot of polls, because obviously that's not about just going to a group of people, selective group of people, and asking the question. There's a rigor that's done to actually gain the opinions and views of people in the issue. And we find overwhelmingly there's support for Sharia in the Islamic world. And people have made a cost-benefit analysis as well. You may say that's correct. I'm not sure how that works now, but they say that looking at what they see from the Western model, yes, there are certain things that are guaranteed. Yes, there is progress there, but at the same time, there is a social atomization. There is social breakdown. And looking at that, they find that it's not a model that they want to import into their countries. Now, I'm not sure, how would you respond to that? Would you accept that that's a utilitarian judgment that's sound, because it's based on what they think is beneficial? So you would say that we should make more decisions like that and reject Western values more because of that? Or would you say that that's incorrect? I'm not sure how you would actually gauge that, because each time it kind of, we're bumping from accepting natural law to rejecting it, to living by it and it being the dominant mode in society, saying, well, no, actually, it's completely wrong, we should be utilitarian. There are lots of different bases that seem to be used within your answers.
No, there's only one basis, and the answer is, like any consequentialist judgment, it would depend on the circumstances. Can I just reply to you? Bertrand Russell famously said that there were circumstances in which to offer people liberty and democracy was to mock their condition. And I do accept that there are countries in which things are so bad that